Hi everybody. I said I think that most of the learning for you happens when you try and write code and you make 1,000 mistakes, which is normal, and then you look at different people's solutions and you kind of learn, oh, this is a better technique, oh, this is a common mistake, and then you go back and you revise. One question I'm going to have is whether or not that process of looking at other people's code and making the revisions, if you would prefer to do that in class the way that we did the first time, or if you'd prefer me to record a video like we're going to try out right now. So at the end of the video, I'll have you guys submit a quick form that tells me kind of what you prefer. Okay, so this wasn't one of our problems, but I wanted to show it to you anyway. So let's pretend that the problem was find the sum of all multiples of 3 between two user-supplied numbers. So it's similar, well, so it is the problem from the first homework set. Things that pop out at me when I look at this are lines 12 and 14 because they don't actually do anything. Each of these methods is returning a maximum or a min, but the return values aren't getting saved anywhere, so these should really just get deleted. This part looks great. I mean, the spacing's a little bit weird, but that part looks great. And now we're testing to see if the values of I are multiples of 3. If they are, we print them, which is not the same thing as adding them into a sum variable. The really big, strange thing, though, is the else statement. The else statement runs if the if statement is false. So let's pretend that the first I value is 5. It'll say, is I divisible by 3? The answer is no, and so it will immediately print there are no multiples of 3 between your two numbers, which is clearly not what's intended. So this kind of mistake is one I've seen in several places, and is definitely one I'm going to try and trip you up on in a test. Don't put an else statement if you need to wait until all of your values have been checked in order to conclude something. So you can't conclude that there are no multiples of 3 until all the values have been checked. So don't put it in the if statement. You would want to put it after the for loop was done. Okay, I didn't look at every single person's solution to the find largest odd value method, but I looked at a good 12 solutions and no solution worked. And I said in my hint, be careful what you initialize your largest so far variable to be. So let's think about this. So here's largest so far, it's initialized to 0. We're looping over the whole list. For everything in the list, we're asking, is it an odd number? We're asking, is the remainder when you divide by 2 equal to 1? And then we're asking, is that, if that's true, is it also true that that number is larger than the largest so far? If so, we save it as the new largest. So this is the correct pattern for finding largest, and we've got this test that says, is it odd first, which is good. Here's the problem. What if this is the array? We would want this one to return -3, since that's the largest odd value. Think for a second about what this code would actually return if you ran it on that input. I think it's pretty clear that this second part of the if statement would never be true because none of these values are larger than the value that the largest so far starts out at. None of them are larger than 0. So this if statement is never going to be true, and it's going to return 0 at the end, which is wrong. Okay, so what could you initialize this value to? I can think of two reasonable ideas. Well, the first reasonable idea is wrong. The first reasonable idea is, what if we set the largest so far to be the first value in the array? The problem with that is the first value in the array might not be an odd value, so we would have the same problem. So one thing you could do is you could search forward until you find the first odd value, and you could initialize your variable to be that one. That would work. That's a little bit strange and awkward. So I think another nice thing to do is the intent of this code when it's initializing largest so far to be 0 is they're trying to choose a very small value so that way it's definitely going to get replaced as soon as you're iterating through the array. The problem is there are negative values, so you wouldn't want to choose 0 as your smallest possible value. You would really want to choose integer.min value, because integer.min value is actually the smallest value that's possible for an integer. So that would be a safe thing to initialize it to. So that's going to be one of the things I'm looking for when you correct your homework is, have you initialized it to something sensible? Okay, let's look at several solutions to, oh, let's not do this one yet. We'll come back to that one. So let's look at several solutions to this method that's supposed to identify whether or not there are three adjacent, three adjacent odd numbers or three adjacent even numbers. So this code has nested for loops, which is the pattern that we've been using. But this is one of the fundamental things that you got to figure out is when do you use nested loops and when do you use a single loop and just look at adjacent indices. And this problem really brings that out. Even this person's method name says contains three adjacent, but then look, if we're using A, B, and C as the indexes, do the A and B and C values really have to be adjacent? I think the answer is clearly no. Like A could start out at 0, B is going to start out adjacent, but it's immediately going to get larger. So this is the pattern if you want to choose all possible triplets of values from the array. But these triplets of values are not going to be, not going to be adjacent to each other. The other weird thing about this code is it's testing to see if the values are equal to each other rather than whether or not they're all odd or they're all even. So this is like a very puzzling thing for me to see. Let's take a look at another piece of code. So this one, we have a single loop that's looping all the way through the array. They've written is odd and is even. This is a little bit subjective, but I would say that to my taste, it's not necessary to create helper methods for that. I think it's okay to just have a test like what's the remainder when you divide by 2. So they're saying so let's test to see if the value at I is odd, if the value at I plus 1 is odd, I plus 2 is odd, or are all three of them even? That seems reasonable enough. I'm noticing two strange things though. One is that the return false here is inside the for loop. So this for loop is only going to ever loop once, and it's going to return true or false. So that's like a huge bug, and this is a signal to me that whoever wrote this code didn't really try very hard to test it, which is kind of a bad sign. I think you should be working a little bit harder than that. Okay, there's another kind of strange thing here. Well, this is good, actually. So this person was paying attention to not going out of bounds, which is fantastic. They said, okay, well, whatever value of I is, we're adding 2, and so you want to make sure that I plus 2 is in bounds. So they put an if statement here. That's like kind of a novice programmer-y thing to do. A more professional thing to do is what we would see, well, let's spot it down here. Okay, so just have I loop up to array.length minus 2. So that way you don't have to put in the if statement. You just don't have I loop up as high. Okay, so a couple of problems with that one. This one looks very, very clean. And in fact, this is probably my favorite answer. So here, this person didn't even use two if statements to check if all three are even or if all three are odd, because they realized that whatever the remainder when you divide by 2, those just have to be the same as each other. So either all three are 0 or all three are 1, but the point is they're all three the same. So they're saying, is the remainder the same as the next one? Is the remainder the same as the 1, 2 afterwards? So that's super duper clean. The return false happens at the end of the for loop. So that's very beautiful code. This one is an interesting solution. It works. It's a little bit longer, and it's a little bit harder to trace the logic. So here they have an odd count and an even count, and as they're looping through, they're saying, okay, if it's even, we'll set the odd count to 0 because we're done counting odds, and we're going to increase the even count. Otherwise, if it is odd, now we're done counting evens, so we'll set our even count to 0, and we'll increase the odd count. And so if it's ever the case that we see one of those counters equaling 3, we know we must have seen 3 adjacent. So this is actually fairly clever, but I think if you compare it alongside this solution, this to me is clearly a lot cleaner. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't probably remove points for this one, but I think sort of as programmers you want to be aiming at kind of the cleanest constructions you can be all the time. All right, so here's another one that comes really close. I've seen a lot of people start to do mod 2.0. I'm not really sure why people are doing mod 2.0. That's kind of a strange thing to do, so I would say please don't do that. So the subtle thing here is I think this person's else statement, it's ambiguous. So we've got an if and an if and an else. Is this else supposed to be the else attaching to the line 46? Or is the else supposed to attach to line 45? The indenting here reveals the way that the interpreter is actually going to understand this, which is this else actually attaches to the if on line 46. But that's actually a bug. I don't think this code is going to work. Okay, so let's look at this last problem called zero max. The idea is you're going to take every zero in the array and you're going to replace it with the largest odd number that occurs to that zero's right. So this right here is incomplete because I didn't show you what this method looks like. But this is a very, very clean solution. You can just read it down like English. We're going to loop over the whole array. If a value in the array is 0, then we're going to find the odd to the right. And you give it the array, and you give it the location we're at right now. So presumably inside this method, we're going to start searching at lock plus 1, and we're going to find the largest odd value between lock plus 1 and the end of the array, and then we're going to return that. And that's what gets saved into the value that used to contain the 0. So that's super duper clean. I saw a lot of people do something essentially like this, but with worse style. Here's what that looks like. So this is a similar idea. Already it looks like you don't want to read it as much. Am I right? That's one of the reasons why you use helper methods. The more important reason why you use helper methods is if you need to debug. Having independent methods makes things a lot faster and easier to debug. But let's just look through this. So they're looping not quite to the end of the array. If the array contains a 0, now they're starting a new loop at I plus 1, so at the next value, and they're going to the end of the array, and they have got a max odd value, so it's like the largest odd value they've seen so far, that starts, and so now they're saying, like, if they see a value that's larger than the max odd value so far, and their value is also odd, then let's replace it. So this is sort of the maximum pattern, right? And so line 55 is where that loop ends. So on line 56, we should have the max odd value, so they assign it. And then they reset it to 0 because in the next iteration, maybe we've gone past where that maximum odd value was. And so maybe the new maximum odd value is going to be smaller. So not only is this, so this works, well, this almost works. It's got the same bug that we talked about at the beginning of the video with this initialization. But other than that, this works. Other than it having sort of worse style than this, I think it's also very fragile. It would be very easy to forget this line 57, where you reset the max odd value to 0. And if you forget line 57, now the code is really broken. Whereas in this one, it's not possible to have that same bug, because the contents of this method won't let you fail to reinitialize your max odd so far variable, because every single time you start the method, it reinitializes it. So this is going to be particularly relevant in the code we're about to start working on. This is going to be an example of code where I would take off points, and you really need to start using helper methods like this to make your code clean and easy to debug. All right. Let's look at maybe, there's one more example. So this is a very interesting approach. Let's just read it down. So they're finding the largest odd value. Here they're looping through the array, and they're counting up how many zeros are there, it looks like. And if there aren't any zeros, then they just exit immediately because there's nothing to do. There's no values to replace. Okay, so now they're starting from the end. This person can't have run their code because this would immediately be out of bounds, because array.length is not a valid index. Array.length -1 is the first valid index. But starting from the end is kind of a clever idea, because as you're going, you can be testing to see if the values are odd, and if they are, you can be saving them into the largest odd so far, and then if the value isn't odd, you can test if it's 0, and you don't need to search ahead because you already have the largest odd value saved into your variable, so you can just save it directly over top of the 0. So I think this is a very clever approach. Too bad this person didn't test it. I'm only gonna say it so many times about like you got to test your code. I'm going to say like in the near future, if it's very obvious you couldn't have tested your code, I'm just going to immediately take points off because it's like kind of no excuse for that. Okay, cool. Well, I hope that you learned some things about your own code. I think it's going to be hopefully educational for you to revise your code. If you have any questions about your individual code, I'm totally happy to answer it. Just shoot me an email. Good luck, and I'll see you guys next week.